Hi, welcome to valuationpodcast.com, a podcast and video series about all things related to business and valuation. My name is Melissa Gragg, and I provide divorce valuation and mediation services in St. Louis, Missouri. Today, we will discuss active and passive appreciation of separate property in divorce with the esteemed Dr. Ashok Abbott, who is an associate professor of finance at West Virginia University. He is the founder of Business Valuation, Inc., where he provides value by determining statistical significance, validating economic models, and providing rigorous empirical analytical support. So basically, just a super expert at research and all things valuation. Welcome, Dr. Abbott. How are you?
It's good to be here.
Very good. So we're kind of talking about an interesting topic in valuation and divorce. So if we can start with some simple terms that people can understand and talking about how we divide and distribute the marital estate. Like, what are the 4 questions that somebody should consider when they're looking at maybe some separate or marital issues in a divorce?
See, we first start to define what is property. See, because unless you know what you're dividing, it's hard to find an equitable distribution. Now, once we know that the property this is an asset that is part of the estate and needs to be divided, the second question that you need to answer is this marital or non-marital? Because there's a very wide variation across the country in different states. And sometimes, even within the same state, different circuits may have different case law that they follow. And that tends to make this a very preliminary and very important question to be answered before you start looking at how much is it worth and how much of that worth needs to go to each of the 2 individuals.
Well, and I think in one thing that you said that is pretty important is in a divorce, how you determine property, how you separate property, and then how you value property. But it is state specific, and so part of what you have to understand is what the state rules are, and then also, kind of the if you can determine the property. Then the next step, right, is how do you start to determine if the property is marital or separate?
Right. And there again, there are significant differences, even though 40 states are so-called equitable distribution, 9 are community property. Alaska is kind of both. They have their own world, of course.
Right.
I mean, they're so close to the pole. But then, very important question is, one, knowing what is the premise. 2, how is that being applied? And as a valuation person, I get very uncomfortable when someone across the aisle starts interpreting case law. A valuation person is typically not well versed in discussing, interpreting, or extrapolating from case law. That is the lawyer's province. Our daughter, who is a lawyer, and she reminds me very frequently when we start talking about any kind of case law, that is something that's the province of the court and the lawyers to decide.
Yeah.
And as a valuation person, you work within the parameters that are set.
And I think it's an important distinction because what you're basically saying is that we, as experts, will provide evidence of that something started as separate or continued to be separate or is marital, but we're not making a legal conclusion
Right.
on whether that. So we're just showing evidence that kind of walks somebody down a certain path, but the attorneys are really going to determine if it is marital or separate in the eyes of the court.
So that's the important distinction that we, as an expert, one needs to maintain. Because as an expert, you're a servant of the court. Your presence in that room is to help the court receive and analyze the evidence that needs to be presented. The conclusions are outside your province. So that's something that I try to be very clear about when we start discussions in these cases.
Yes, absolutely. And one thing that you also mentioned, which I think it would be helpful for people to understand, and this goes in line with how the states are different, but can you explain to us how marital property is distributed or like what a community property state is? Because we talked about equitable distribution, which again is a different concept, but let's first talk about community property states.
Right. For example, California is a community property state. So there, it's very interesting. Since family law is essentially an area of equity, there the fairness concept is inbuilt into it. Mm-hmm. So even, for example, California, they were the very first ones to have no-fault divorce, and then they really changed the world. Interestingly enough, it happened at the same time that man was setting foot on the moon for the first time. 1969 is a very important year in that. Now, once they did that, however, they again go back to the same kind of fairness analysis, even though they are not explicitly calling it that. You would be familiar with the two doctrines that California follows: Van Camp, Pereira. Those are the two kind of seminal case law streams that have developed there. And again, even though they don't call it that, but it's essentially, they say, if the appreciation is majority by effort, or is it majority by economic conditions? And then the distribution follows. So they do that, but they start from a different premise that this is the part that we are looking at.
Yeah, and it's kind of the difference between active and passive appreciation. Right. When we're talking a little bit about it, because we're going to get into talking. I mean, you can look at marital and separate property of businesses, of bank accounts, of securities. So a lot of different assets. We're kind of focused on the valuation for business. Today. Right. Yes.
Today we are looking at another day we can start looking at how to trace them and how to track, for example, investment accounts.
Yes.
That's a whole different hour. But right now we are looking at the change in value of business during the marriage, and we are starting with the premise that it has been identified as a separate property.
Right. And one final thing that I think just kind of to talk about is when you have an equitable distribution of marital property. So what does that mean?
See, equitable is, again, the fundamental concept in equity. We are looking at not taking a chopper and running it down the middle. Okay. Mm-hmm. What we are looking at is what is fair. And the definition of fairness, again, changes from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Right? It's very interesting. I have, since I work all across the country, you come across concepts the way they have been developed over time, that what is fair or equitable in one state may just not be fair and equitable in another state. And if you go to Florida, circuits have developed in that way, that the same word means different in northern Florida and southern Florida. Mm-hmm. The way case law has developed, things have been quite different. So that's why it becomes very important to be very clear as to what is the narrow tunnel through which this snake is moving.
Right. And a lot of judges, I think a lot of courts don't like to use the word fair anyway, because is it really fair? And in our world, we have fair market value, we have fair value, we have all these other terms. And
Right.
so I think equitable is just trying to be like, what could be even-ish, right? Like
Right.
fair-ish, right? It
Fair.
doesn't mean 50-50. It means, does it make sense to this couple?
And like in New York, and at times when they start looking at distributing based on effort,
Mhm.
there are some circuits that kind of, as a default position, fall on the 80-20. The in-spouse, since the growth or the value is created by their efforts, get 80%. I mean, they start at 80-20 and then kind of move it up, move it down. They try to fine tune it, but it's very different. So the idea of what is equitable changes very significantly from jurisdiction to jurisdiction.
Right. And typically somehow summarized in statutes or case law that you can talk to the attorney in that state and things like that. But also, I think if you're going to practice in certain states,
You need
most of the
to
time you need
read
to
up.
know it as well,
You
right?
need to you need to read up. I mean,
Yes.
you won't be interpreting it. You will not be saying based on this case, such and such is the number, but you need to be aware of what is happening, what is the practice that has developed there, and what are the parameters within which you have to work.
Because this is a complex issue that's pretty deep into valuation theory. And
Very.
so to make an assumption that an attorney knows all the case law surrounding this issue is probably not the best assumption to make.
So what would happen is that you would have done your own research, but you will present it to your attorney, the one you're working with, and then let them make the decision as to what is.
Yeah.
The definition changes. So you have to go with their definition, but you may be able to help them to put everything in context.
Yeah, and the hard part about this area, I think, also is that the case law is different. And so even if you're in a state that is just bordering another state, it could be significantly different how they deal with this issue. And one way to really get yourself caught off guard is to not have done your own research.
Right.
And even in some cases, to educate them on the nuances of the valuation issues, right?
Right. See, that's what you have to do. You have to
Mm-hmm.
work with them. See, that is why, like, I, for example, do not do primary valuations. Okay. I'm an add-on to the valuation.
Sure.
I deal with a specialized area, whether it's discounts, whether it's distributions. But important thing is that it's very important for the lawyer, the basic valuation person, and the specialist to be working together in tandem from beginning to end.
So, in cases that may have this issue, you might come in and just talk about this specific issue
Right.
as opposed to do the entire valuation,
That's right.
which is common in business valuation. But if we kind of go back to still defining it, because I want to get to some of your research, I want to get to some of all of the things that you have done. But I think there's still, just an understanding, a base understanding of what is active appreciation in an
Right.
asset or business, because those are a lot of words that people may not totally understand.
That's right. And see, the way the concept has developed is that even though states have different interpretations, but the fundamental principle seems to be shared across at least all the equitable distribution states. That is, that they are making a distinction between appreciation occurring as a result of efforts or resources provided by a spouse versus the appreciation resulting from, even though the different states call it by a different name, but they call them economic factors, or changes in economic conditions, or Carolinas, they say inflation and other factors.
Mm-hmm.
So they are talking about what Turner, I mean, that's the basic text that you have in passive appreciation. He calls them market forces, the impact of market forces versus the efforts or resources of the spouses.
Yeah, and another kind of way to look at it is if I'm working in the business, am I
Mhm.
doing something that's making that value increase? Or is it, like we've had some businesses that are just so large that like your impact may be very tiny little bit. And so there's more market things going on. And that might lead us to kind of the passive appreciation in an asset or business has to do more with the market or outside factors, right?
See, it's very interesting. You brought out an excellent point. The largest single claim in a marital distribution, a check for almost $1 billion, right? Do you remember what case it was?
I don't remember what case it was.
Okay. This is the petroleum company,
Mm.
and they had fracking that they developed. In fact, the technique was developed, and the company grew from about $50 million to a lot of billions, okay, over the marriage. And of course, when the marriage fell apart, that increase had to be distributed. And obviously, the outspouse lawyers, they said, not a problem at all. So you're starting from 50, you're going to 10. So it's a growth. And initially, the value is almost negligible, right? Because compared to the ending value. So let's just write half of the company, and you're done. And at that point, obviously, the in-spouse had good support. So what they did was they said, okay, let's look at a petroleum company. Let's look at what constitutes value of that company. And they ran a similar kind of analysis. And basically, the number came out to be that it's largely market determined. You have 1 billion barrels of oil sitting in ground. Whether the oil is worth $15 a barrel or $220 a barrel gets decided outside this company. And the petroleum company's value changes with that. And so ultimately, it became, the court decided that it was a 20% was active and 80% was passive. So the $2 billion that it would be, the appreciation would be worth, was split equally. And the check for $1 billion was written.
That's crazy.
That's how it works.
Well, and this is really a story that kind of leads us into like why we even care about whether a business has active appreciation or passive when we're going through a divorce. Because some of that has to do with how that appreciation or that change in value is either directly related to one of the spouses,
Right.
or not.
Right. It's a question of marital resources, and those resources can be financial or can be efforts. So your labor is a resource.
Mhm.
The fundamental concept is that the marriage is an economic partnership. Both individuals, they bring their endowment into the business. They increase that value over time through either effort or by resources that they brought in. And then at the end, if and when that dissolves, then the fruits of that labor have to be divided. The fruits of those resources have to be divided. So that is where we run into this need for active versus passive analysis.
Well, and I think that you'll also read a lot of cases, or you'll get to know cases in your state that the out spouse, we call, the non-business owner spouse, is saying, well, I worked in the business at one point, or I answered the phones, or I, did some administrative things. And that's usually where they're trying to get to some participation in the value, right?
Right. See, and depending on the state, now I'm in West Virginia here, you come across cases where baking cookies for the party, taking the kids to sports practice is all effort. Now remember, that is very valuable contribution that the out spouse is making, whether it is by directly working there or by making time available for the in spouse to be there. So that is where now you have again segued very nicely into the next area, where you are looking at really not being two pieces, but three pieces of this appreciation. The passive appreciation, that is from the market forces. Also, the appreciation in excess of what happens with market forces, is it coming from one of the spouses, or as you were talking about a large business where there's a large workforce, you may have the CEO as one of the spouses, but you have other senior level managers that are working and that are contributing to that growth. So that's what we need to be looking at, is what is attributable to individual spouses as part of the active growth. Now, active growth is something which is very hard to measure, quantify, or empirically establish. Mm-hmm. So basically what we end up doing is we look at the passive, which is very much quantifiable. So essentially you claim passive and you give away what you cannot claim as passive is active. And then the question becomes, of that active, how much is active from the participant, one of the two spouses?
Yeah, and you can see this happen in family businesses that have maybe transferred down to generations through gifting or other things that maintain some separateness. But then you could have one generation that all of a sudden makes it, gets it on the internet and starts to increase the value and gets more revenue and gets all of these things. But like once we've identified that we have to do some analysis, right? We've at least we've said that there's some analysis to do. Now you have come in and wrote a research paper that's titled "Passive Appreciation in Divorce: A Quantitative Measure," and people can access this, and we'll provide links. But tell us more about this research, because it's very important for valuation experts on the how do we quantify, right?
Right. See, that is where really empirical research is needed and is applicable. And I've been doing this now since I think the first major case that I did in this area was in 2005. Okay. So this has been going on for about 15 years specifically. The techniques have been known for a while. There's a major paper that Engel and Granger, they did that, and they got the Nobel Prize for that. Because that was the first time that they developed an empirical test for causation. So that's the important part. Mm-hmm. Before 1995 or so, we had all this concept of active and passive. Everyone talked about it, but no one had the causation set as an empirical test. The important thing is because ultimately what the statute has laid out is that what is caused by the market forces. And that causation has to be established before we can start measuring as to what proportion is there attributable to that particular cause. So that is what this paper is about.
Well, and I think that you said it also before this, but part of it is how do you go in and you try to quantify the passive factors. And so
Right.
how do you determine what effect these passive factors have on the business valuation?
Right. So it's a two-step test.
Okay.
First, you have to determine that in fact there is causation, that it does make a difference. See, for example, consumer sentiment is something that's talked about a lot in marketing, saying it drives the market. Sentiment is high, so people are buying. Or sentiments are going down. So, for example, in real estate markets, you hear that the word mentioned a lot. Okay, people are buying because they're looking at some expansion, or people have stopped buying because they're afraid. Okay. But interestingly, when you start looking at it empirically, even though by itself the sentiment does appear to be a factor and has been well accepted in marketing as something that drives the markets, but that the way the sentiment is measured is essentially as an index based on employment level and income level. So the concept being when people are employed full time, they are making good money, they are ready to buy things. So if we have income, if we have employment, and then we add on sentiment, that sentiment by itself, that index may not be adding much value. So that is why it's not a question of in isolation is this particular factor important or not, but the ultimate question is in combination, what factors stand out, influence the outcome, or what factors are in fact manifestations of other factors that we could be looking at. So that is the empirical testing that one has to go through to establish what are the factors and what are the independent factors that are driving whether it's a revenue, whether it's free cash flows, whether it's discretionary earnings. Important thing is that you need to establish the attribution to the cash flow that you are using for valuation. That is why valuation and the passive appreciation analysis, they have to go in tandem.
Well, and I think that it's not just about looking at some economic reports. Like
No.
your research paper really goes into more detailed ways of how to support your conclusion, as opposed to saying, I think that
Yeah.
it's going to be this, because a lot of times the business owner always thinks that they are the business and that they are the whole worth of the business, but that's not always true.
Right. See, if they are the business, then it's all active appreciation, and they should really be writing that $5 billion check.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what ultimately the case was Ham versus Ham.
Gotcha.
It's a very interesting case. It's a very well developed case. It was obviously because the stakes were so high.
Sure.
The quality of analysis done in that was really good. That's something that one should really read as a base text in looking at active and passive issue.
And there are some states that really don't outline it as much. There hasn't been a lot of case law in it. So sometimes it seems a little like the Wild West. I know that we've seen cases where if there was appreciation in the value of the business, it's also, has that business owner been fairly compensated
Right.
for that? So
That's
like
important.
lean years, what if they stop paying themselves? things like that.
See, that is where the whole issue of, so when you start doing lifestyle analysis, when you start doing income analysis, and when you start doing basically what is entering the marital estate.
Mhm.
So it's just like the stock. You buy a stock, either you get the dividends, or if the company is able to reinvest them, then you get a big capital appreciation at the end. So that is kind of the same thing. If the individual has been drawing a large salary or some compensation out of the business, which has been entering the marital estate, and then to go back and say, because this business could pay this kind of a salary, therefore it must be worth $1 billion, uh, kind of becomes a hard sell.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that, in looking at this, that's where, when we go back to what you were suggesting, is this is where on occasion you would include an outside expert. And so you could have somebody come in and say, was that reasonable compensation?
Right.
Was this passive or active? How did you quantify? And then still maybe have two experts, because some of this is subjective, so we're trying to put a wrapper on how to put a number on it, and
Right.
there's a lot of moving pieces.
So that is why when it is subjective, and in some cases there are things that cannot be quantified, but the idea is to reduce the area of subjectivity.
Mm-hmm.
What we want to do is we want to set the outer limits of the uncertain area as narrow as possible. And that is what empirical analysis does for you, is that it allows you to take things off the table. And then yes, is it reasonable? Is it not reasonable? That could be partly subjective, partly again, that expert that comes in is going to look at what is the level, for example, where publicly traded companies are paying of the same caliber, same performance, what are the salaries in those areas. So as a percentage of revenue, let's say, if we say on an average, a well-run company pays 30%, 40%, 50%. And then you have this individual who is being paid 70%. Then yes, there is compensation that's additional, that has been taken, and that has already entered the marital estate.
Well, and I think that it's interesting. You brought up a couple times, like owning a share of stock.
Right.
And quite frankly, owning a share of stock is sort of the perfect example of passive appreciation. Maybe? No?
Potentially.
Potentially. Okay.
Again, say question is, for example, if you're a CEO or a CIO, someone at the C-suite level, part of a very substantial part of your contribution could be stock options.
Okay. Yeah.
Right? And there, the value of those options changes with your performance.
Very true.
It's very important to look at, is that change in value a function of just the market, or is it as a result of the effort that you're doing? So one of the studies we are in the process of doing, we're looking at, there are very substantial differences across industries on how the managers are paid and what drives their compensation. There are industries where you are really being compensated or rewarded for increasing the revenues, even though those companies, the revenues are not translating into bottom line. But
True.
as long as they're bringing in the revenue, they're being handsomely rewarded. There are other companies, typically more established kind of companies, where you're rewarded for increasing the bottom line and not the revenues. And the performance that you see in those companies is exactly what people are being rewarded for. If you're being rewarded for increasing revenues without regard to the bottom line, then that's what you will do and collect your big bonus because you generated another 100 million in sales. Now, whether that 100 million added value or not, or in some cases, we found that, it was interesting. There were some industries where an increase in sales was reducing value. The free cash flow was going down as the revenues were going up because they were giving huge incentives. They were making all different kind of adjustments to book those sales. So the more you sold, the less you made. And still, because the company had decided to invest in increasing sales and was compensating these managers, that's what they were doing.
Interesting. Now, what if I just owned like a share of Apple stock or Amazon stock? Could there still be components of active and passive appreciation in there if I'm just an outside holding some piece of stock?
Typically, no.
Okay.
If you have nothing to do with the business of that company, your asset is the stock,
Yes.
then that is a passive appreciation.
Perfect.
Provided it was bought before the marriage or out of separate resources and kept separate ownership. All that commingling stuff has to be out.
Right. As long as you haven't done 800 other things with it that could cause it to be something. But I think that helps people understand that you really have to be like outside of the wall of the business to just have it be completely passive.
Right. See, the 100% passive situation can be only like buying corporate stock and not have big enough that you are influencing the policy. Remember, that's the whole idea. I mean, if you are a 10% stockholder of a company, you may be having input in how things are done.
True.
But if you are 1/1,000,000th of the shares are owned by you, you don't count for anything. So it's all passive.
Yeah. And with that being said, that share of stock could take on marital or separate components, right? Even if we're not dealing with this issue, we could have that there were dividends that went to reinvest and buy more stock. And then you still have to go back to the state that you're in and figure out the difference between income and appreciation, which is for another topic. But
also, I mean, that would be, for example, was the reinvestment being done by you, or was it a drip plan that had been set up before the marriage? So it was an autopilot. See, it's very interesting. If you receive dividends and then buy back stock, every time you receive that check, you touch that check, what have you done? You have reduced its value by 30%. It's taxable income. So you have to look at all those nuances as to what has happened over the life of the estate.
yeah. And some people will do some planning in order to take the income off of a separate asset and try to keep it into another account to protect it. But most of the time when you're dealing with these issues, you're going to have an expert come in and kind of walk them down that path of the information that gets you to a conclusion that the judge then can make, whether a portion of it is active or passive, separate or marital, things like that. But you talked about a couple of cases, but do you have any past cases where separating the marital assets were just like almost impossible or completely difficult?
Until you go in and start digging. That's the important part. Remember, the market forces are something which are very prevalent. No business occurs in a vacuum. We are not in space.
Yeah,
So
right.
everything is happening right here. So that is why it's very important to go back and dig. What is it that drives this particular market?
Mhm.
What is it that drives this particular product? Now, see, one of the most interesting things that I came across was it was a chain of shoe stores, and it was a very unique concept. What they did was they would go to Italy, look at the very high-end shoes. You're looking at $3,000, $4,000 a pair kind of shoes. Put them in a suitcase, take them to China, and have the people there make something which was very close but not exact.
Mhm.
So they had people that would be looking at, like, the shape of the buckle is patented, or that particular cut where it starts moving up from the mid step is patented. The sole has a certain tread that's patented. So they would have people analyze that shoe and then make an almost replica, but not something that could be seen as an infringement of the patents.
Mhm.
Okay, so and then they were selling these shoes. All they started in Florida, but then they expanded all over the East Coast. Okay. Interesting thing. If you looked at just the population and the income and all, there wasn't much relationship. But when you started digging, actually that's what happens. You sit down with the owners and you say, who buys your shoes? Where do you sell them? What is the group? And then what we found was, after about a week of talking to their managers up and down the line, even going to some of the stores and sitting there in the background, seeing who is coming in and
Mhm.
buying those shoes, what we found was that these were young women between 15 and 24 that were their prime customers. So when you look at the demographics of that particular ethnic group, that particular age group, it corresponded to that growth about 70%.
Hmm.
So the change in this ethnic demographic group was driving their success beyond anything else. Of course, it was a well run business, but if they did not have these customers, they would not have the market.
Right.
Older people were not buying them because older people, if they could afford, they would buy the real shoes.
Right.
And these young, the tween market, these were kids that would not have the kind of money to buy that kind of a shoe, but they would very much want to be. That was an aspirational shoe for them.
Right.
So
And
when you
and
did
their
that,
friends are never gonna figure it out, so they're okay with it.
that's what happens. So they
Yeah.
can go out and be wearing those shoes, and everyone is looking and doing ooh and ah, and they're happy. And we found that that was, again, another factor that came out important was most of them did not have money even to buy these replicas
Hmm.
in that sense. So a lot of them were essentially running on credit. So the credit card interest rates became another important determinant.
Hmm.
And then the employment level in the 15 to 24-year age group in that region again became a determinant. So by the time you were done with these passive factors, close to 68, 69% of the growth was coming from these identifiable, quantifiable, specific factors.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. If I kind of wrap it up in how I looked at it differently was after, talking to you and looking at the research, I think that normally we just tend to go to the business owner and we tend to say, okay, how can we quantify how their effort has created value? And this is really doing it differently and saying, okay, can you look at the passive side and say,
Right.
what were all of these factors in the market, in the industry for this particular company, locally, all of it that is more tangible, at least in our world, like it's more quantifiable
Right.
because there's statistical basis
Tests.
for some of
Tests.
it,
See,
right?
under Daubert, basically, you have to have your analysis. Is this something that has been done before? Is this accepted? Is there a known rate of error? That's the critical point that comes in. Can you quantify how likely are you to not to be wrong?
Mhm.
So if you say, I can be 90% certain that within this narrow band is the total amount of passive appreciation, or I'm 95% certain, or I'm 75% certain, depends.
Mhm.
I mean, obviously, your cone keeps getting wider as your certainty level starts getting narrower and narrower.
Right.
Okay. So what is acceptable? That's again the court's decision. So you give them that cone. Say, if you want 75% certainty, more likely than not, then this is the minimum, this is the maximum.
Mhm.
If you want absolute, like 99% certainty, then this is the minimum and this is the maximum.
Yeah. And I think I think we've already kind of talked towards some of this, but in the research that you kind of shown of how to quantify it, can a business valuation expert utilize this research in court to discuss, to, put a number on passive appreciation?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, that's the short answer.
That's the short
The,
answer.
the long answer is that in torts, this method has already been used and accepted. And when we're talking about torts, we're talking about class action suits, we're talking about where you have hundreds of millions, or in a couple of cases, billions of dollars involved.
Mhm.
Courts have accepted this kind of analysis in those. So there's precedent.
Yes.
And there's a list of some cases as an appendix to the paper, the really big ones that have been decided, where the courts have used this kind of methodology to quantify the numbers.
And as you quantify some of those passive pieces, are you also using kind of third-party data
Yes.
to support your conclusion?
Remember, the data are essentially demographics and economic data.
Mhm.
And a lot of that data is paid for with your tax dollars. And the
Yeah.
federal government makes it available. Now, as with all federal government stuff, it's not something that you can just like download and start using the numbers.
Sure.
They have a huge amount of information that's available. But that information, you have to really know where you need to go and get, and what is where. They have a wealth of information that we are all paying for as it is, because it's a line item. The Census Bureau and the Bureau of Economic Analysis are very well funded. And
Which, if you're on the stand, it feels better to say, this is government data
yes,
that I've utilized, as
that's what I
opposed
use.
to, according to my experience, skills, and
Right now,
knowledge,
it
it's
looks
this.
like, yeah.
Yeah.
So that's the thing, is the data are there.
Mhm.
You have to know where they are. You have to know what to do with them. You have to apply the tests that are accepted. I mean, that's what the basic Granger work that I use. And they got the Nobel Prize for that. So,
Mhm.
and I think I'm fairly confident when I go there and say, if they say that, is this something that is peer reviewed? Yes, sir, it has been peer reviewed. Or yes, ma'am, this has been peer reviewed. And in fact, the authors received a Nobel Prize for this, developing this methodology. So
Mhm.
that does become a little bit better than saying, I think it should be 10%.
Yeah, absolutely. I think anytime that you can rely on pulling together a lot of data and information and have a logical way to discuss it
Right.
is going to be beneficial in court. Um, and you're just putting basically a wrapper around how to do that in this specific in the passive and
Use.
active appreciation.
Right.
Yeah.
So that is where you are, because you are a servant of the court.
Hmm.
Your presence there is that it will help the trier of fact to make an informed decision, and you fulfill that function
Hmm.
by being there and by providing something that is empirically supported, something that is replicable. See, the wonderful thing about empirics is that you can have 20 people run that same calculation using the same data, and they will come up with the same number.
Hmm.
And they may not agree, the experts may not agree with each other, but if they follow the same process and they start with the same base set of numbers, the end number, when you add 2 to 2, is 4.
Right.
So that's what makes it easier for people to wrap their head around it. It's easier for them to see it illustrated.
Hmm.
And as you rightly said, when you're using government supplied data, there is no indication that you're making up the numbers.
Right.
Those numbers are there, anyone can get them. And basically, in a lot of cases, you have a data set that you're using, and the other side will request you to share that data set, and you will do that. Right? This is public data.
Hmm.
So both sides have the same set of numbers to start with, and you can do that set of calculations side by side. And if they make an assumption that you do not agree with, then the impact of that assumption becomes clear. This is how it's changing.
Right. Well, and I think even your example with the handbags, right? And the shoes, or kind of what we call knockoffs, it makes sense. And as you were even describing it, I could kind of relate and say, oh, yeah, I could understand what that demographic would do.
Right.
So anytime somebody is filling in that story, then you've not only hit it with the numbers and the quantification that's justifiable and supportable, but you've been able to walk them through the story.
So that's what you have to do to the court. And that's your function. You have
Mhm.
to help the trier of fact reach their conclusion. And how you do that is by providing them with a roadmap
Absolutely.
rather than saying, this is the spot.
Right, exactly. Well, and Dr. Abbott, this has been an amazing podcast. I think that one thing that I would want people just to know a little bit more about you, you've focused on research for a very long time. You've been a very important part of the valuation community for decades. But tell us more about like what you are focused on right now in your career and how people could reach out to you.
See, I mean, it's a very old way to put it. The gentleman's gentleman. You know, the groomer was the gentleman's gentleman that made them look good.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I look at in valuation. My function is to make you look good in the court. So, like BASF says, we don't make cars, but we make your cars better.
Right.
So, I do not go ahead and do these full blown valuations,
Sure.
but I make your valuation shine. So, that is why I become an embedded part of the team.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, at a couple of the major firms in the country, valuation firms, they're embedded part. So when a specific question comes up, like discount for lack of marketability, blockage, active passive, okay, statistical testing, where see, you what has started happening, I've started noticing that about 10, 15 years ago, is that a lot of people are running regression models and presenting them to bolster what they are doing.
Mm-hmm.
However, there are certain fundamental assumptions that need to be met before you can use a regression model. And a lot of them are not doing that. Okay. It's regression is something, I mean, mathematically, it's a fairly simple equation.
Mm-hmm.
However, what goes into that equation and whether those variables belong or they don't belong there, that becomes the issue.
Well, and just describing it, I mean, I think that if, there's always going to be cases that can't warrant multiple experts. We understand that. But when you have a situation such as the $1 billion Ham v. Ham case, it's going to require somebody that just comes in. Like, I'm even thinking as a valuation expert, like, why wouldn't I want to pass off the hard part to you?
And that's what happens. I mean,
Yeah.
that's where I come in, because remember, for a valuation firm to have someone like me on their payroll full time is a luxury,
Mm-hmm.
right? And at times, I mean, unless they are really the kind of cases that I work on, typically in a mid-sized firm, I'm not talking about a large-sized firm, where I may have 10 of those in a year. But in a mid-sized firm, there are going to be only one or two in a given year.
Sure.
And at that point, having someone full-time sitting there is expensive.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm not being facetious, but it is expensive. It's a fixed
Mm-hmm.
cost. And so the more fixed costs you can turn into variable costs, better your realizations are,
Yes.
lower your break-even becomes. And that's what I have.
Yeah. No, I think that's been very helpful. And we're going to provide your contact information,
Sure.
a link to the report, the research report. It might take them 1 or 2 times to read through it because it is good valuation theory. It's not fluff by any
See,
means.
JFAR is a respected journal
Mm-hmm.
for forensic accounting. They are the top journal in the country.
Mm-hmm.
They're run by American Accounting Association. So that's a fairly serious place.
Yeah.
If you want to put a paper in there, from the like, I've been active in this area, but from the time I started writing this paper and it went through the revisions and all, it was almost 1.5 years
Oh my
from
gosh.
the time of first submission to the time that they said yes, prime time, ready for stage.
And are you working on your next research project yet?
Actually, the interesting thing is that this particular paper is now turning into a book.
There you go.
So that's what is happening. Is I'm looking at a sample of about 40 to 45 industries for which data are publicly available,
Sure.
retail data. So the same concept, but this had one specific used car dealerships, because that's an area that had not been explored and is now becoming a very significant part of automobile dealership networks.
That's awesome.
That's why this paper came about, because that was it was an entity that needed to be valued. I was working with someone on that project, and it's a nationwide chain, and they sell these what they call certified pre-owned. It's no longer the used car market,
Yes.
but what the luxury car makers have done is, as the prices have been going up, they have started, and a lot of the sales are being done to Hertz and other places where they're leasing companies. So these leases, when the cars come back off the lease, the manufacturer is taking it through the factory, refurbishing it, changing anything that needs to be changed. They're making it almost as good as new, and then they are moving those through their dealerships. And that is where this term certified pre-owned comes from.
Sure.
So it is pre-owned. It has been already sold once. But before it gets sold the second time, the manufacturer goes through this whole process of refurbishing, cleaning up, making sure that things are working, and then they sell it with a warranty.
Oh, yeah.
So
Sure.
that's the big difference between a CPO and buying a used car. So this segment is the fastest growing segment in automobile sales at this point.
Because so many people are leasing.
So many people are leasing, and when they come off the lease, then they're being sold.
Mm-hmm.
See, automobile manufacturing is a very peculiar way that it's hard for them to change their production plans.
Sure.
So these are large. I mean, you have conveyor belts full of cars going through, and they cannot stop or start making things at short notice. So a lot of demand management that they do, rather than doing the supply management, but the supply is relatively fixed. Their demand management is by making price adjustments.
Mm-hmm.
For example, when you go to do a lease, the one of the prime determinants is what is the repurchase value that they assign to it at the end of the. And by moving that up or down a little bit, they can change the lease payments a lot.
Right.
So at times they are trying to lease more cars, at times they're trying to sell more cars, and the incentives and the pricing is moved around, just like in an aircraft. I mean, the three people in this row may be each paying a different price for that seat.
Sure.
And that is because there the supply is what it is. A plane, once it takes off, has taken off with so many seats.
Right.
So you change the price to fill those seats, or if there's a big demand, to make it more expensive for someone who definitely has to go on that flight.
Yeah, absolutely.
Automobile manufacturers are doing the same thing.
That's awesome. And when you have the book out, it's going to be basically a guide for the
It's a guide. It's a
community.
guide to passive appreciation.
Good. I think that will be very valuable.
I think it will be useful because it illustrates the concept through different industries. And the way the publishers are planning is that it would be redone every year because
Sure.
the new data come up, all the demographics, so it will be updated every year. So it will become a serial publication.
Yeah. And something that we would need every year to update our own analysis.
It would be useful.
Yes.
Let's put it that way.
Well,
It's a good tool to have.
yeah,
It's
absolutely.
something.
Especially because, like we said before, you're not going to deal with this concept as much as some other concepts. And so when you then deal with it, if you can't call in, an expert like yourself to come and help, then you're going to need to know what you need to know.
Right. I mean, you need to know the parameters.
Correct.
And then, so the idea is that once you can narrow down the parameters, negotiation becomes much easier.
Absolutely.
Because ultimately, I mean, it is something that both sides agree to, or the judge finds in between those upper and lower bounds. And that becomes useful.
Well, and if you've done a significant analysis and the other side either did nothing or just wanted to rely upon their skills, reputation in number of years in the industry, you have an actual thought out process and then just kind of coming up with a number. The judge and the courts are going to see that something is a little bit more defendable.
They see that. And it's interesting that what you find is that a number of judges are very sophisticated. And they are not going to sit there and run the analysis themselves. But when you present it to them, and if you present it right, that's important part. It's almost like teaching a graduate seminar.
Mm-hmm.
Is when you go into the courtroom and you are helping the trier to reach a certain number. That is what you do. You are there and you are walking them through the process step by step. And they really appreciate that. And they know that. And they know the value of that.
Yeah, that's awesome. So we'll definitely maybe have you on again when we can talk about the book, but I appreciate all of your time and we will give them information of how to reach out to you and get the article.
Anytime. See, important thing is that if someone has a question, not necessarily a particular case that they're working on, or they're working on a case, but it's not something that would be really needing this level of analysis. If they want to bounce off an idea, they're welcome.
Oh, that's awesome.
I mean, I do that a lot. I mean, that's how in industry you start getting known and kind of because you contribute. I mean, it's not just a question of no money, no talk. It's not that. So specific numbers, obviously, if you have to talk, then I need to be on the case because otherwise I could be like conflicting myself out of something else.
Sure.
But if it's a concept, I'm always happy to talk to someone about their concept.
Well, that's a gracious offer.
And they're welcome to call in and we can spend the 15-20 minutes that's needed. And that's not a problem at all.
All right.
I do a very fair amount of that.
Oh, I'm keeping you in mind if I ever need. I will definitely be calling you.
Anytime. You're most
Thank you
welcome.
so much, Dr. Abbott. We appreciate it.
You're welcome.